got an all-star panel of guests, and I'm gonna run through the names quickly, and if I get anyone's title wrong, by all means, feel free to correct me. But first I wanna say a big thank you to Carrie Ellington with New Haven Tenant Power for helping bring so many of these organizers onto the show today. We talked a lot about who should be on here, so thank you, Carrie, for helping put this together. So on the show today, we have Ashley Blount, is how I pronounce your last name? Perfect, one for one. The Deputy Director of CT Core Organize Now. Got Eric Cruz Lopez, Program Coordinator with CT Students for a Dream. Bruni Pizarro, the Interim Executive Director of Junta for Progressive Action. Kiran Salim with New Haven Legal Aid. And Sarana Bike with Mutual Aid Hartford and Connecticut Black and Brown Student Union. I hope I got people's names and titles generally right, but correct me if I'm wrong, and listeners, you kind of get the idea. So Ashley, I wonder if you could kick us off by kind of helping define the parameters of today's conversation. What is the Cancel the Rent Connecticut movement, broadly speaking? What are the main goals, and why is rent cancellation such an important topic of conversation right now?
Sure, and I'll start from the top. So Cancel Rent is a multicultural, multi-class coalition of CT organizers, leaders, and grassroots organizations who are demanding that Governor Lamont cancel rent and mortgage payments during this time. And that will be for renters, homeowners, small business, and small landlords. We understand when all excuse me, fumbling my words, we understand that all the attention should be on the movement for Black lives right now. We understand that and hold true to that in this coalition. We understand that folks are rallying and protesting for their lives and literally laying out in the middle of the street in solidarity of that. And what this coalition understands is if you really care about Black life and Black people, you also have to make sure they have a safe place to live. And intersectionality in this group looks like we defund the police to cancel rent. We defund the police to have equitable education. We defund the police and understand that all immigrants are essential. We also understand the words of Audre Lorde, like there's no such thing as a single struggle issue because we do not lead single issue lives. So some of those folks who are also undocumented are also Black folks. And we have to understand that we live here together and we all intersect. And we also understand, although the governor has put in place temporary rent measures, this does not address the fact that rent and mortgages are still going to be due after July 1st. As of right now, tenants will still be responsible for these payments. And at the time when working residents are losing jobs, wages, and numbers that we'll get into later. So we're calling on Governor Mott to, number one, stop all evictions indefinitely. We know that he has called the order to halt the filing of most new evictions through July 1st, but what happens after July 1st? And that's been our conversation, speaking to other organizations, speaking to leaders, what happens after July 1st? And we want to ensure that our folks are safe. There were thousands of cases pending when the governor declared this public health emergency on March 11th, and over 100 cases were filed since the governor declared that emergency. So understand that in that small pocket of time, 800 new eviction cases were filed. So those are also things that we want to let folks understand, that this is urgent, that right now we're the 4th day into June and April rent is due. So we're calling for a cancel rent now. We're calling for an immediate executive order that extends this eviction moratorium, that dismisses all those eviction cases that were filed since March 11th. We also are calling that cancel rent, that it starts at least 45 days after the declared state emergency is lifted. And the forgiveness of rent, that means forgiveness of rent and not deferment. So not that I have to pay later, that it will be forgiven. And also, we're being real bold in this. Eliminate rent increases for the next 5 years. We're being very bold at this time because we know folks are listening. And if anyone else wants to include it more in that.
Well, I do. I want to reiterate just one more time the very simple, maybe even deceptively simple definition of cancel rent. But I think it's an incredibly important one, and one that maybe listeners are not familiar with. This isn't just a demand that rent be pushed out to a future date, which is ostensibly what the governor's executive orders have done so far, pushing out April rent for really all tenants by 3 months, and then May rent by 2 months for people who can, who say that they've been affected by COVID. That, I think, if you spend a couple seconds thinking about, means that a huge pile of rent is going to be due on July 1st, or at a date coming soon. So could you just, again, in a sense, before maybe we go to Kiran, could you say exactly, cancel rent means there is no accumulation of debt. What was ostensibly owed through previous, contract with the landlord is canceled.
Exactly that. It's a forgiveness of debt. Cancel rent. I don't know how any more plain to say that. Cancel it. You have something. It's go. You take it back. It's not. We're canceling it. Understanding that, and Karam will get into the weeds of it, but like there's been thousands of people who have filed for unemployment since the stay-in-place order. These folks are not going to have a job come July 1st, and if they do, that income, like there are other bills that also have to be paid. So understanding that rent is like 30% of most folks' income, or if not more, that there are also other bills that have to be paid. So yeah, we might wait till July 1st to pay, but 3 months of back rent at one shot is quite a bit to ask for anyone.
Maybe Karen, you can maybe pick it up from here. So there is a diverse patchwork of renter protections in place or recently expired around the country. And I think that some observers have lauded Connecticut for, at least initially, having some of the more progressive protections, in that people did not have to immediately pay rent in April and May at the height of this crisis. But maybe could you, from a legal perspective, could you give our viewers a bit of an update as to what the most kind of pressing upcoming deadlines are for renters? June 1st was a big one. And also how, from your perspective, Connecticut has compared to other states around the country, maybe how New Haven's compared to other municipalities, but maybe if you could weigh in.
Yeah, so I am definitely not a housing attorney, Tom, but I can tell you what I'm hearing from the housing attorneys and other folks at New Haven Legal Assistance. I work mostly in the labor and employment department, but all of these issues, right, are intersected, and we're hearing the same thing from our clients, right, across the board, that they're having, trouble paying bills, paying rent, all of that, and they're worried about evictions. But Ashley kind of went over this, but this month, June, right, the 2 months extension to pay April rent is ending. So April and June rent is due. May extension is only in place for those people who were able to ask for it in writing. So if you didn't ask for it, that's also due. And if you did ask for it, that's coming up. There's nothing in place for June rent. This means starting July, landlords can start eviction process.
It looks like we may have lost.
What about now?
Sorry, I think that may have been me. Sorry, so you were saying that that June 1st rent is not alleviated by the governor's orders as those orders currently exist.
That's correct. This means starting July, landlords could start eviction processes for people who can't pay rent. So what we're trying to say is this is urgent, and we're going to see many folks displaced soon. There's going to be a surge in eviction processes starting July 1st for many folks, and we want the governor to do something about that before that happens.
And I understand there was also a statewide pause on the execution of evictions that had already made their way through court. But from what I understand, that pause ended June 1st. So this isn't the filing of new evictions, but rather the execution of evictions that have already been approved by the court. Karen, I don't know, I know you're not a housing attorney, but from what you've heard, is that true? And have you and your colleagues seen an increase in evictions actually being executed, as in people getting kicked out of their homes this week?
I cannot speak to that, Tom, but I think there is executions. I think right now still can't be issued, but I think that we have been hearing that landlords are harassing folks and threatening people with eviction, like across the board, even though that is not allowed right now.
Breen, this show, I really want to shine a light on the actual work that people in the community are doing to help renters in this time of crisis? I mean, obviously this is a public health crisis, this is an economic crisis, and the history of the United States is a racial injustice crisis, but we're feeling that particularly acutely right now. I wonder, as the head of Junta, if you could speak a bit to the work that your organization has been doing over the past weeks, 2 months, 3 months, to help renters in particular, and to support this Cancel the Rent Connecticut cause.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Thomas, for having us on your show. I wanted to just touch base with what the mission of Junta is and where we started from. We've been around for over 51 years to be exact. And we started based on community organizing. Those were our roots. Because when the Latinx community in particular felt that the systems around them were failing them, community organizers stepped up and said, okay, let's build this institution from the bottom up. And so thankfully, we've been doing this for 51 years. And I think in terms of the vision of Junta now, especially this moment, it calls for advocacy. Of course, it calls for sort of supplementing these needs from from a social services sort of angle, but also from an advocacy perspective. So Junta is poised to do both at this moment. And so we have case management services that we always provide to our participants. We started a GoFundMe called Pay Rent Fund, Fondo Pa Pagar la Renta, in late April, because we were ahead of this and we're thinking, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to our constituents? Food and rent are the highest priorities for our participants, the highest need. And so we felt that, this hashtag Cancel Rent movement was super, super important, especially for persons of color that have already been disenfranchised by the systems that we know, and that there's deep inequality that happened before COVID, and how COVID is unmasking all of that inequality. And where are we now in this moment? So the moment calls for elected officials to make some real changes. And as the leader of this organization that has been in existence for 51 years as a symbolic representation of Latinidad and in the Latinx community, who has been disproportionately disenfranchised by negative health outcomes, what this means is that if we have a homeless situation on our hand, this is a homeless crisis. This is going to be a homeless situation, a crisis, a housing crisis on our hands. That means that we're going to have more people that are going to risk infection. They're going to be displaced. This is only going to exacerbate the inequality that we're already seeing. So in order to prevent that, so it's kind of like both ands, we're meeting the need, but then we're also trying to prevent this from kind of getting more out of control, because then there's no quick fix. We're in solidarity with this movement, in addition to providing basic services and creating this GoFundMe.
I want to maybe bounce between Sarana, Eric, and back to Ashley to talk about tenants that you have spoken to over the past weeks, months, kind of people on the ground, about what stories you have heard about the challenges of being a renter right now, or if any of you are renters, any experiences you have had dealing with landlords struggling to pay rent. But I really want to, as people who work in mutual aid, as people who talk to some of the most kind of marginalized members of society on a daily basis, could you relay some of what you have heard directly from people or experienced about what it's like to be a renter at this moment of incredible insecurity? Maybe if we could start with Sarana, who works with Mutual Aid Hartford, and then over to Eric, and then back to Ashley. But Sarana, if you could get us started on that.
Sure, thanks. Sarana or Ra with Mutual Aid Hartford. We've been operating since this pandemic started, a citywide intake form, mostly for grocery and food assistance. And we've redistributed about $35,000 and over 10,000 pounds of food within the city of Hartford. The biggest request that we're seeing by far is for assistance with bills, rent, food. People need all their needs met across the board. We've had people suddenly have no income, people with large families, moms with newborn babies that are isolated and alone right now with no way to support themselves or their loved ones. we're talking about the risk of infection as we face this crisis of housing. It's already happening. We talk to so many people who are already contacting us or are contacting us a second time saying, and my family from Florida just arrived, and would you be able to bring food again because this family member has now moved in with us. I'm taking care of my grandkids. So that this crisis is here. It's not coming. People are already hit far too hard by this financially. People that sustain themselves, through being self-employed or whatever mechanisms they have no way to support themselves. So I just wanted to emphasize the fact that from the beginning, that's the biggest request that we've had is food and rent. And Eric, pointed out those are the same need, right? It's just human rights, right? My basic needs to live. And talking about this housing crisis, while I agree we've by no means seen the biggest impact of it, it's here already.
Eric, could you speak a bit to, does that ring true with your conversations with people over the pandemic too, that the biggest requests have been for money for help with food and rent?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I want to highlight Sarana's last point, right? Like, having food for rent, but not having money for food, like that's the same problem, right? Like plugging one hole, but you still have another, that's still a rent problem that could be solved with a cancellation of rent. Over the past couple of weeks, over the past month, Connecticut Students for a Dream has gone through a process of really calling all of our members and doing a wellness check-in so we can redistribute any resources that we are able to. And pretty much every family that we call can't pay rent, doesn't have money for food, or can't pay their bills, right? And every time we talk to them about cancel rent, it makes sense to them, right? There's no tenant that I've talked to that is against cancel rent, right? Because they're living it. They're living it, they're struggling with it. And in Norwalk specifically, I've been connecting with some other people in the school district, and I've been hearing that there's actual families who have been evicted during this crisis, which we know is illegal, right? But we know that to a certain extent, some landlords are taking advantage of immigrant and undocumented families in different ways during this crisis, right? So that's what we're seeing. That's what's happening. And I know Hartford City Councilman Josh can talk a little bit more about that as well.
Excellent. And yes, and first I want to welcome Josh Mickham, Hartford City Councilman, to the conversation. Thank you very much for joining. And I'm going to come to you in just one second, but first I want to come back to Ashley just for her response. Again, as someone who has worked, CT Corps has been doing mutual aid from the very beginning of this crisis. As you said at the top of the show, the work, the anti-racist work that you do, the tenant support work has been going on for a long time. But Ashley, I wonder if you could speak to, in New Haven, what you've been hearing from tenants and renters about the struggles they've experienced and what kind of what they need most right now in order to survive this pandemic in the short, mid, and long term.
Echo those same sentiments that you heard before. Like, folks want to eat and they can't pay their rent. And there are some landlords that are harassing tenants. I think when it comes to the mutual aid work, there was a form that was put out. And on that form, in terms of responses, the response was overwhelmingly for housing, support, rent, and food. So back to the points that have been made, like prior to me, like all of the responses have been for basic essential needs. And even thinking about someone who is filling out a form online, they are really in dire straits and they really need this support and resources. I know I can speak in terms of the Black community, and especially being from the Black church, there is some shame around reaching out for help, especially to folks you do not know. Even though we're all in this global crisis, we're all here, we're all in it. And I think that is where we put the integrity and dignity back into our work, and ensuring that our folks feel safe for speaking out for what they need. If we are collaborating together as tenants who can pay their rent, as some folks who are part of our coalition who are landlords, who are also allowing their tenants to not pay their rent right now, providing that space, we know that this is a problem all across the board that needs to be solved. So the stories are all the same. They're just coming from a different place in the state. All the stories are the same. And I just think that's something to reiterate, that we're like, this cliche has begun, we're in this together, which is not true. Those forums have been overwhelmingly filled with Black and brown folks. So that's just another thing that I want to point out. The folks who have been filling out these forms have been Black and brown folks. And that is not an easy task to fill out that form and put it out into the internet, hoping that someone is going to get back to you, whether you know them directly or not.
If I may interject, Thomas, on that, in terms of, and Ashley, thanks so much for bringing that perspective to the fore, especially with the tenant survey that was distributed statewide by #CancelRent. I think in alignment with what our findings from that survey, Junta's also seeing many of our constituents with COVID are extremely and then on top of that, they may be undocumented and renters are having a really, really, really tough time because they're fearing deportation if if they're displaced. It's a real stressor. And especially, there's just a situation right now where landlords are threatening our constituents, and we're sort of bracing ourselves, but also trying to work with legal teams to try to see what we can do to advocate on the part of the pay rent fund is here. All right. Well, yeah. So again, what we're trying to do is trying to figure out what is the need first and foremost. That we're not making this up. This is something that these are narratives. It's not just anecdotal evidence. It's real people's lives. So I just want to make sure that that the Latinx, it's the Latinx and the African American community, the Black community are in alignment with that. That is what's happening. It's disproportionately impacting our communities, and there's some real truth to that.
So you're listening to Pandemic Organizing on WNHH-LP, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and we're talking with a whole bunch of organizers with the Cancel the Rent Connecticut movement: Ashley Blount, Eric Cruz Lopez, Bernie Pizarro, Karen Salim, Sarana Bike, and Josh Mickdom, who I'd love to bring into the conversation now. Josh is a Hartford City Council person. And Josh, I heard you on Lucy Napatangel's Where We Live earlier this week, and I'd like you to kind of repeat a core kind of point that you brought up there, which is that the Cancel the Rent movement, I think, is espoused by some of the most progressive Congress people like Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, seeks to shift the burden of navigating federal government bureaucracy onto landlords and off of tenants. A lot of people ask when they hear about Cancel the Rent, does this just mean that every landlord is going to default on their mortgage and become homeless themselves? Could you kind of expound a bit on that, on how Cancel the Rent is not necessarily designed to punish landlords, but rather seek the federal government to provide subsidy to them, but automatically waive rent for tenants?
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for having me. I think that the key to recognize is that no one, as far as we know, caused the pandemic. It's just a big burden that has fallen on all of us. And so we have to think policy-wise about ways to distribute the burden fairly. And that doesn't mean evenly, because some people are better positioned to deal with an economic hit than other people. And as a general rule, tenants, and especially rent burden tenants, especially folks in the most precarious situations that we're talking about, whom I represent in Hartford, are the worst positioned to take an economic hit, and also the worst positioned to navigate a bureaucracy. One of the things that, sort of going back to your previous question, I've gotten a lot of calls from constituents who say that their landlords are trying to evict them illegally, because I put out a lot of flyers and I drove around with a loudspeaker telling people what their rights were. So then they called me and they said, okay, but what do I do? And the level of stress that those folks are under, just like, you can hear the anxiety and the desperation that, and I think it was Bruni who said, this has always been the case. We're talking about folks who are poor, who are living near the edge, who are often exploited. And so now they're in a position where that pressure is at a maximum. And so to turn around and say, okay, now I need you to prove that you qualify, prove what your income is, make an application to the state or the federal government, is a recipe for leaving people out, not just undocumented people who may not qualify, but just anyone who's operating with a super high level of stress. Landlords, I'm not going to say it's not stressful, especially for small landlords who maybe have one unit and then they live upstairs, but they own real property. They have at least engaged with banks and mortgage lenders. There's a lot of programs already in place from the federal government to provide them with forbearance so that they're not at risk of getting immediately foreclosed upon. So they're just in a much better position to take the initial economic hit and then get help to recover from it.
I want to run through some of the comments we're getting on Facebook. Harry, thank you very much for passing these my way. And also, I've neglected to mention so far that Johnny Shively is also with us. Johnny, thank you very much for being on the show today. And I would love to turn to you in a second for your input on cancel rent movement. But first, let me go through some listener comments dating back to the beginning of the show. Got someone, the Generalist Party, posting, if you cancel rent, you have to cancel taxes. Jeff Klaus saying, what about the debt owed by the landlords to lenders? Rosalind Mendoza, if rent is canceled, us homeowners need mortgages waived as well without penalty. And John Conway, how exactly do you cancel rent? What if the building owner has a mortgage? Annie Harper, the landlord can apply for support, just taking the immediate burden off the renter who is least able to manage it. I think that gets at what Josh was saying. Colby Angela Merritt, this is a basic human right and this is a racial issue. We know Black folks are going to be most affected by this and kicked to the streets. We cannot let this happen. The Connecticut government needs to step in and cancel rent now. And then I'll read one more. Instead of choosing which bills not to pay, why not advocate to government for more general subsidy? That's by Jeff Klaus. Josh, I want to go back to you one more time to, as the one elected politician on this panel, I want you to speak a bit to cancel the rent Connecticut as an explicitly political issue. At least one of the more kind of baffling responses to the pandemic that I find around the country are people, kind of wringing their hands and saying, don't politicize this public health issue. That this, this is not something started by anyone in particular, that it's great leveler, that, this is a time for, great bipartisan camaraderie. But, of course, nothing in this country is apolitical. The $2.2 trillion CARES Act is, an explicitly political document. And where, power is concentrated in this country helps kind of dictate the terms of which companies are bailed out and who gets relief. So I wonder, as a politician, could you speak to the political advocacy that you are doing on behalf of Cancel the Rent, that you feel needs to be done in order to get this kind of renter relief? And whether this is this a hyper-local issue, is it a state issue, is it a federal issue? Maybe you could speak to the politics of this a little bit. I'd be grateful.
I think, I'll start with Connecticut because it's what I know. It has to be, as you say, it is a political issue because it's government and government operates politically. But it's an issue on all levels. But I think for us, we have to look a lot to the state government simply because of the way finance is structured, right? The cities don't have the money to do anything, honestly. They're the whole setup of state finance and education finance, which I'm sure you've had shows on, is one that leaves the cities without a lot of money to spread around. So it has to be a state issue. And that has been a big part of our advocacy, and mine in particular as the one politician, is calling state reps who actually talk to me, calling the governor who has not talked to me, calling the governor out on Facebook and Twitter, which I don't know what good it does, showing up at the governor's house with a loudspeaker. Again, I'm doing it because I'm out of other ideas. But the other thing I've seen a lot in talking about the politics of this and sort of the partisan part of it is that it sometimes gets framed as sort of a moral issue, as sort of a moral, if folks were saving more or more prepared, this, this wouldn't happen, or that it's somehow unfair to give them a handout. And I think it's a moral issue in the sense that we should take care of people who are in a precarious situation. But there is also a pretty good structural argument, which is that if you have a lot of evictions, you end up with a lot of foreclosures. And if you have a lot of foreclosures, you end up with a lot of out-of-town speculators buying up properties, and then you have out-of-town landlords who traditionally don't take as good care of their property. They hurt the overall quality of the community, the life of the community. So even if one is unmoved by all of the things that we've talked about in terms of people we're trying to work with, it is bad policy from a structural perspective to let communities go.
I'm going to do something dangerous with so many panelists, but I'm going to ask a somewhat open-ended question and see who wants to jump in on it first. But I think that it's a critical one, and it's something that Ashley and Josh have brought up a few times. And I think if, at least for me, if the Great Recession and the housing crisis of 2008 did anything for our kind of American cultural imagination, it exploded the notion that people don't pay their mortgages because they're deadbeats, which I think was a pretty, a top-down pushed idea that, if you couldn't pay your mortgage, then it was because you were doing something personally wrong. It was a personal failing, it was a moral failing, just pay your rent, just pay your mortgage. Yeah, and, I think that the massive, mortgage and consumer fraud that has been exposed that the banks and mortgage servicers engage with showed that, no, these, it wasn't necessarily that people weren't paying because they were, nefarious. It was because of structural reasons that they were lured into, dangerously kind of structured mortgages, but also they were already living on in great precarity. So I wonder if the question I'm going to throw out to the group, and I don't know if who wants to jump in, is kind of what work are you doing to explode this nefarious stereotype that people don't pay rent because they're deadbeats, because they're prioritizing something that should not be prioritized. What is the work that you all are doing to combat that stereotype?
Yep, I can talk to that, Tom. So I think you're absolutely right. There's this notion right now that the reason we want to cancel rent is because people don't want to pay their rent. Maybe we're canceling rent because people just are mad at their landlords, or maybe just because they're lazy and they can't figure out how to get a job. And that's not why we want to cancel rent. The reason that we want to cancel rent is really simple. It's because people already can't pay their rent. I'm going to say it again because I think it's so important. The reason we want to cancel rent is because people already can't pay their rent. And I want to share some data with you that supports that. That comes from the Connecticut Department of Labor and also from the US Census Bureau, courtesy of a tweet that Data Haven just put out. So since the beginning of COVID-19, over 500,000 individuals in Connecticut have filed successfully for unemployment. That number doesn't include undocumented residents or individuals who have not successfully been able to access unemployment, which means that the total of unemployed individuals is even more than 500,000. That's a huge number. And it's important to note that even before COVID-19, over 50% of renters across the state of Connecticut were rent burdened, which means that over 30% of their income went toward rent and probably competed with other expenses like food and transportation. And when we look at people of color, that number increases. So before COVID-19, 60% of Black families in Connecticut and 55% of Latinx families were rent burdened. And so now that over 500,000 folks that we know of are unemployed, it becomes even more difficult to afford those basic needs. I also want to direct you to some stats, like I mentioned from the US Census Bureau. So between March 13th and May 19th, 79% of Latinx families, 64% of Black families, and 40% of white families in Connecticut reported that their household experienced a loss of income. Similarly, 26% of Latinx households, 31% of Black households, and only 6% of non-Hispanic white households reported that they had sometimes not enough to eat or often not enough to eat, meaning food insecurity. And I want you to notice that huge disparity between 30% between families of color and 6% between non-Hispanic white households. And finally, in mid-May, 46% of Latinx families, 38% of Black families, and only 22% of white families had no confidence or only slight confidence in their able to pay June rent. And so those numbers show us not only the extremity to which this crisis is impacting people's ability to pay. Like folks have mentioned before, people are making decisions to choose whether to pay rent or to literally put food in their families' mouths. But there's a racist disparity between who is most impacted by this crisis. Black and Latinx families are disproportionately insecure in their ability to pay rent and to put food on the table for their families. And so, again, I want to reiterate, we're demanding that Governor Lamont cancel rent because people, again, can't pay their rent already. And like you mentioned, there's two specific reasons we believe this is the right course of action, maybe more. I want other folks to jump in too, but we want the burden of paying for rent or for accessing your relief to fall on landlords and not tenants. And also we know that this economic hardship that folks are experiencing right now is gonna endure long into the future. And that a one-time relief payment just is not gonna be enough to keep these impacted families out of homelessness and able to put food on the table. So that's some of the data that tells us that this isn't just an issue of people being upset with their landlords. Maybe they're just too lazy, or maybe they just don't want to pay rent. It's not true. We're asking for cancel rent because people can't pay the rent.
I just wanted to add in one thing. I think Johnny got at it, but the why is that we see this disparity. You know, we know it's because of hundreds of years of oppressive racist policies that include racist housing policies. And so the other thing that we are really pushing and saying is that canceling rent is a direct investment in the Black and Brown communities of our state.
I would add one thing to that, more of a less quantitative and more qualitative observation, is that my experience is when people are saying that this need comes from some personal failure of responsibility, some laziness, that's racist. That is like deeply racist. And I think you only say that, a person only says that if they have very little or no experience moving in the communities they're talking about, because I don't think there's anyone who casually just feels okay not living up to their basic commitments. Ashley mentioned it before. I think most of this is accompanied across the board by a lot of shame, and that accusation is just, you got to have your head somewhere other than reality to make that.
And I think you also have to think about just what are other policies that keep families, working class families, at the bottom of the economic classes, right? Like how does minimum wage play a factor into people not being able to pay their rent, right? How do speculators that raise up rents in communities and gentrification, how does that contribute to families not being able to pay their rent, right? And again, how does racist policies around housing contribute to people not being able to afford what they would like to live and having to find some other places to live, right? So all of these other things are also affecting it. It's everything that we talked about, but there's also more, right? Undocumented families in particular oftentimes are not going through the regular ways of a renter, right? Like they have to make some other deals with landlords, right? They have to pay them extra 2-3 months security deposit to be able to get in, right? And so then that's also like it's less of an individual, but for me, people to think about like, well, what are the laws and policies that keep us here, right? And then also what role do businesses play in this, right? What role do employers play in this? Speaking from personal experience, I remember when I was in high school, there was about a 3-month period where my dad wasn't being paid from his job, right? So how are we also thinking about wage theft and how it's affecting renters across Connecticut? And for me, one of the most important things in cancel rent is the governor ordered people to stay home. The governor ordered businesses closed. And so the governor essentially closed the income of hundreds and thousands of families in Connecticut. And without providing relief to those families, that is just, it's racist, it's unfair, and it's unreasonable to make that expectation of renters across Connecticut.
Yeah, I think the U.S. Treasury announced earlier this week that something like $80 billion in unemployment haven't been paid out since the start of the pandemic. You know, the structure of the CARES Act kind of encouraged people to go onto unemployment because, you know, you can't have people within 6 feet of one another and really going to work during a pandemic. But that put a lot of pressure on state unemployment systems that have for decades kind of struggled under disinvestment. I want to catch up with a few comments and then go to the kind of work, the day-to-day work of organizing during a pandemic, because this is no easy thing when you can't really be in close physical proximity to one another. So I want to hear about the virtual or socially distant actions that you all have taken. Maybe if we could start with Ashley and anyone else who wants to chime in. But first, I'm going to catch up with a few comments. Claudia Herrera, cancel, ? Sounds very humanitarian, said that to the bank. It hold the mortgage, but interest still applying and still have to pay those missed payments plus interest. Caitlin Maloney, well said. Jeff Klaus, good to understand, but you're now creating a marketing challenge on top of a financial challenge. Addis Maria Castillo, cancel rent. Annie Harper, replying to Claudia Herrera, yes, that needs to be dealt with, but the immediate need is to take the pressure off renters. Addis Castillo, all of my favorite people, smiley face. Caitlin, how does this connect to the Black Lives Matter movement? Certainly want to get there before the end of the show. Julian Rose, canceling rent in a pandemic is a necessity, period. And Arlen Karina Teles Martinez, I think it's so wild that landlords exist. Canceling rent is the only move. Ashley, could you speak a bit to the actual work of organizing tenants, of organizing renters at a time when you can't really get within 6 feet of one another, and all of the other challenges of having kids at home, having lost your job. There are so many things that prevent people from being able to participate in these types of social justice movements in the way that they might have been able to before the pandemic. How have you navigated that?
It has been quite a bit. I will say personally, even for my personal life, having to stay home and being a community organizer where you have 3 lunches scheduled in one day and then a dinner and then a coffee maybe later, being out and about. So even for my personal life, having to rearrange how I work and how I meet and engage with folks has been quite a bit. So Zoom is the plug. I've been on Zoom more times in these past few months than I've ever been in my life. Which indicates long hours on Zoom, a lot of screen time, and also just allows a different way for us to hold and communicate with each other. There's a difference talking to Eric if we're in the same room and then talking to Eric over a Zoom call or in a chat, a message thread. It's like a lot of layers to this, and we're coming at things a whole new way. Imagination has definitely helped us out a bit. And I'll say that in regards to the caravan that we did last Saturday. We had over 60 cars that participated in Hartford, New Haven, and in Danbury. And there we went around to different legislators' home. We beeped our horns. We yelled outside with our bullhorns. And that way we were able to social distance. Also in that caravan, we were also able to include folks who might not be able to march in a protest, who might not be able to stand for long hours. Folks who don't usually get out to those type of events were able to be with us and uplift us during the time of the caravan. Facebook Live is certainly a thing. Being able to share, repost, like, love. They laugh at me because I love the Twitter storm. I'm not that cool, so my Twitter don't work that well. But
tell us what a Twitter storm is.
A Twitter storm is a set time that we set. It's generally an hour, and we storm Twitter with a hashtag or mentioning a person in particular, usually Governor Lamont, to try to get their attention because we can't, walk into their office. We can't go to the LOB and participate in a hearing. So we have to use our creativity and be imaginative. In the Twitter storm, which we definitely utilize that strategy from other different national organizers that have been doing that. But it's really been helpful in a way that the legislators have been seeing their name mentioned over and over again. And we have gotten some phone calls, no real support, but phone calls. So those are the ways, and I'm sure folks can speak more to that, but those are the ways that I can think of off top that we have been organizing, even though we can't be with each other physically.
Bruni, could you weigh in as well? As the head of an organization that has been doing the work in New Haven for many decades, but maybe how you have kind of adapted to the public health realities of COVID-19 to organize people to help, provide direct relief during this pandemic.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think what we're seeing is I have our case management team. First of all, we're 100% remote, which is something that is quite an accomplishment for us at Junta when we were like never been really paperless. So that was a big undertaking. And we have a warm designated line where our case managers make sure that we're still there and there's continuity of services. So we're hearing and listening to the needs, which I think is super, super important. And in terms of like my position, I definitely stress to our case management team that we have to listen to the needs, especially in this moment. So what we're doing is we're trying to adapt to and think about solutions, especially during this public health crisis, this economic crisis, in terms of thinking about how can we provide those supports so that, for example, if people are displaced from their homes, that means it's going to create greater risk for our constituents. People already have COVID. So many people already have COVID. So how are we dealing with like containing this? It's almost like mitigating and alleviating this burden as much as we can. And this is sort of like, it's not a Band-Aid approach, but it is kind of, because this has been happening since before COVID, as we mentioned already. So, I mean, we're trying our best to, have a diaper delivery service that's like contactless, so that kind of, as we said earlier, if we kind of, sort of redirect the resources. If you have a certain budget and you have to spend money on diapers, then that's money for food, right? If you have to spend money on rent, then that's money for food, or vice versa. So it's about sort of like helping to supplement this need, and so that people can actually thrive, succeed. And these are just like, right now we're in like survival basic needs moment, basically. And I've never seen anything like this, to be honest with you. I've never seen anything like this. The stories that we hear about people like not knowing what their rights are, it is a big problem for me, because there's an issue between understanding myth versus fact. Some people think that they're going to get deported. Unfortunately, that's just what this system has done to people, is really terrorize them into thinking that they can't go to the hospital because they're going to get deported. And that's a reality that a lot of our constituents are facing. So I think we're poised right now to start getting more into the digital era. We have to start creating systems by which we are communicating, and we're the lifeline digitally for our constituents, to make sure that we kind of dispel some of those myths and make sure that we hold our elected officials accountable as well.
Could I just jump in?
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I didn't, thank you for that, Bruni. I want to raise up that this is such a disability justice moment right now, because everybody's like, oh, how are you pivoting to like moving online and like not being able to be physically together? And actually, as like a chronically ill organizer and a mother of 3, and like somebody that's deeply engaged and has been for years in community care work, this is how we operate. Like, this moment is actually not that new to us, to be deeply isolated, to not be able to be physically places, to have to use the kinds of platforms that everyone is adjusting to using right now. And some of the reason that mutual aid has been so successful in certain places is that is just a really basic tenet, that community care is already a basic tenet that's in existence in those communities. And some of those networks are just being formalized right now. And I think the mutual aid networks are so important because they are base building spaces for a lot of the larger campaigns and pushes that are happening right now for the legislative organizing that's happening around the state on a lot of issues.
Now, we only have about 2 minutes left. I know there's plenty more that we could talk about, and I so appreciate everyone's contributions to this panel. But I do want to end on one more comment. I so appreciate everyone listening in and writing comments. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to read everyone, but Jeff Klaus recently posted, "When allies, associates ask the question, why do landlords exist? Open-minded people will tune out." And I actually think that this may be a good way to connect to the current kind of uprising that we're seeing all around this country around police brutality, and in particular a demand that we're going to hear a lot of on Friday at a rally on the Green led by Black Lives Matter New Haven about defunding the police. And I think that some people, maybe like at least Jeff's comment here, why do landlords exist, may turn open-minded people out. I think that a lot of people least readers and the Independent listeners, may be shocked by the call of defunding the police. They see that as way too radical of a response to the current situation. But I wonder how, I don't know who might be able to bring us home on this, maybe Ashley or someone else who could speak to how these seemingly kind of unimaginably radical sounding demands may actually be the most rational for the current moment, given the need. I don't know if Ashley is the best person to respond, or if anyone else wants to jump in. Are we tuning out the open-minded, or is this a shifting of the plane of, possibility?
I could take a little bit on and then pass it over to Ashley to wrap us up, but definitely
please, maybe 30 seconds, Eric, and then 30 seconds, Ashley.
There's a lot of questions. And so if people want to message us on Cancel Rent Connecticut, message us and we will get back to you, right? We want to build community. We feel that our proposal is common sense for both landlords and tenants, right? And we want to work together, right? And the other thing around police and communities and landlords is that what mutual aid has shown us is that we keep us safe, we keep us together, and we take care of each other.
Perfect. Just to add to that, something that came out in our strategy long Zoom call yesterday is that cops evict. So this directly correlates, it directly aligns with the cancel rent. If we really do believe that Black Lives Matter, we also believe that we should defund the police. And if we defund the police, we also need to know that those funds that are utilized to fund our police departments can be utilized to ensure that our folks have a safe place to live. All these things are intersect. And this is the time now where we can really take a close look at that and see how we fall in line. So defund the police, cancel rent.
And my very last question, if people are interested in learning more about the Cancel the Rent Connecticut movement, maybe Ashley, again, where do they go? How can they join in or follow what you all are up to?
We have a Facebook page, Cancel Rent CT. There is a petition that is on that page. We are asking folks to sign. We are close to 800 signatures. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And we really, really need everyone's support. We are calling folks to sign that petition, share it, and like us on Facebook. Send us a message if you have any questions. Folks are dedicated to being engaged with community at this time.
Well, I'm so grateful for everyone coming on the show. I'm sorry that we didn't get to do this for another hour, and I guess we get to look at this wonderful image of someone swiping through the WNHH. But you can find a recording of this on the Independent's Facebook page. I'll make sure to link to all the stuff that we've talked about in my article for the New Haven Independent. We've got Ashley Brown, Johnny Shively, Karen Salim, Bruni Pizarro, Josh Mitchum, Eric Cruz Lopez, Serrano Bike, and Harry Droz, the man behind the boards. Thank you so much for making this happen, Harry, and for keeping us on air. Even as we're doing this remotely. And thank you all, everyone, for coming on the show and explaining this this movement at this really this crisis moment in the United States. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.